And I would like to introduce you to our host for this evening's program, and that is the Reverend Christy Snow. And she is the founder and spiritual director of the, and I have it on my internet page and I closed it for myself, of the Charlotte Center for Spirituality. I believe that is what it is called. And she is going to take over from here.
It's close. I'll tell you all about it. So good evening. You know, during such a time of divisiveness and uncertainty and global unrest, it is just refreshing and inspiring to come together with individuals and organizations who are committed to social justice and reparations. So good evening. I am Reverend Christy Snow. I am the founding pastor and spiritual director of Carolina Center for Spiritual Awakening. Nice try, Donna. It's okay. It's long. I'm also a member of the Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice, and I'm here to be a voice for justice. That's what I feel called to do in the world, is be a voice in the hands and the feet for justice. But I feel like to do that, we have to learn. We have to learn from our history in order to create a better future. So it is an honor to be with you all tonight and to co-host this event. Being open to learn, I feel, is vital to life, and learning from our history is extremely important. It allows us to understand our past, which in turn allows us to understand our present and to consciously create, not just recreate and repeat, but consciously create a future together. I've found these restorative justice teach-ins to be profoundly effective ways to learn more about the history of our Black community here in Charlotte and the injustices done to our Black citizens, so that we can in turn address ways to be architects of a future that rights historic wrongs in our city. I know for myself, when Keith Lamont Scott was killed, it was such an uprising in Charlotte. I remember in 2016 joining so many protesters on the streets of uptown Charlotte. Our focus was tight, and it was held on social justice. But after a month or so, the protests stopped, and for many, the focus on the issues of systemic racism began to weaken. For others, however, like the colleagues on this call tonight, that focus was heightened. Protesting is important, and there's so much more to be done. Our city and our world is operating from a history of injustice to Black people, which built a system of oppression that must be dismantled. It's time that we build something together, something new, but to do that, we have to own up to the shortcomings of our past and learn how to be the solution that we wish to see. That's why I'm so grateful for each of you being here tonight to learn not only about our past, but also about how to be part of a better future. Carolina Center for Spiritual Awakening is honored to partner tonight with Stan Greenspan's Center for Peace and Social Justice. Our spiritual community stands for awakening to our divine potential. Those are our buzzwords we say a lot, but it goes further, awakening to our divine potential and living to build the beloved community and create a city and a world that works for everyone and leaves no one out. So I just want to thank you all for being here, the panelists, my co-host Reverend Willie, who may or may not be able to be here, but also Rabbi Judy, who's filling in. I appreciate all of you being here with us tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you, Reverend Snow. You're an amazing leader. You're also an amazing musician. So next time we got to get you singing, or maybe you'll close us out with some music. We are thrilled to have you all here. We are here to talk about restorative justice. We have spent a lot of time talking about the wrongs of the past, and tonight we will hear three amazing perspectives on those wrongs that have been done, those historic wrongs. And then the question is, how do we right them, right? What is the process of restorative justice? We know that so much of the history of our community has been built upon a false narrative of a hierarchy of human value, that those with darker skin have been exploited and marginalized and not been part of the promise of America or of Charlotte. And it is time for all to mean all when we talk about opportunity for all. And so we're going to learn about the wrongs that have been done. So as a Stan Greenspan Center, we started to learn about, we were working on affordable housing, and we met with county commissioners, and one of the county commissioners handed us a proposal, a program of development that was moving forward called Brooklyn Village. It was a $693 million project being built on property that belonged to a community called Brooklyn that was dismantled, demolished, and you will hear about that. And we spent 14 months listening to the horrors of what happened, the businesses that were destroyed, and the schools, and the homes, and the whole community dismantled. And we listened, and we thought, what could we do to make that right, the wrong to restore what has happened and the wrongs that have been done. And so we looked at the different areas of harm, and we listened to the community. So tonight's really a listening session, and we invite you to write in the chat as you hear wrongs that have been done. Please write what you think would be some restorative measures. In Judaism, when a wrong has been done, there are 3 things we do to right that wrong. We apologize, right? If I borrow Donna Tarney's guitar and leave it in Trexler Courtyard at Queens on a Saturday night and drunken students break her guitar, I say, Donna, I'm really sorry, I broke your guitar. Number 2, I buy her a new guitar, I restore it. And 3, I don't do it again. So we are seeking an apology, and you will hear about a resolution we're creating at the end of this program. B, we're seeking to restore wrongs and accelerate upward mobility for the African American community. And C, we are seeking to change systems so we don't continue to create harm. So we'd love to hear from all of you about that. So at the end, we'll talk about ways you can continue this journey, ways in which you can bring this work into your organizations, your neighborhoods, your community, and ways in which you can join us to call the city and county for an apology, to call the community to make personal and donations, and to talk to businesses and to really get those funds in place that they can be distributed to where they are needed, and to join us in changing systems. But first, we want to we're excited to hear from our speakers, our very talented, exceptional historians and community leaders. So on our panel tonight, we have Reverend Dr. Sheldon Shipman, Skip Shipman, a friend and a scholar and an inspiring leader. He's senior pastor of Greenville Memorial AME Zion Church here in Charlotte. He is a motivational speaker, a community activist, an Afrocentric educator, senior minister and pastor of Greenville Memorial for the past 37 years. He looks way too young for that amount of time. We have Dr. Tom Hanchett. He is a community historian. He probably knows more about Charlotte than anyone else around. He served as the staff historian for 16 years at the Levine Museum of the New South, where he curated the permanent exhibit Cotton Fields to Skyscrapers, named Best in the Southeast by the Southeast Museums Conference, and Dr. Pamela Grundy, historian, author, and activist, who is author of Color and Character, West Charlotte High, and the American Struggle Over Educational Equality. So we'll invite Reverend Snow to offer the first round of questions for all of you, our panelists.
All right, and again, thank you, panelists, for being here tonight. So our first question is, during this moment of protests and uprisings, do you see these marches as leading to real and substantive change? And Reverend Dr. Shipman, you want to start us off?
Sure. I would hope that the momentum that we've seen since particularly the murder of George Floyd, that it started this momentum all over not only the United States, but even the global uprising. I would hope that that the momentum that we are seeing that has gone on for so many weeks, never in my lifetime have I seen the number of protests all over the country as well as the local globe. But I pray that the momentum will continue to the point that we will start seeing something greater than Confederate flags coming down, greater than monuments being removed, greater than even making sure that we're looking at doing some police reform in various areas. I hope it will become more substantive and more institutionally changing. It's nice that the City Council, I'm grateful that they made a wonderful declaration. I believe it was on June 16th that said that Racism is now being declared as a public health crisis. That's a wonderful declaration. Now we need to do something substantive where we can actually see some funds in place to be able to do something to try and change that venue.
Thank you.
I can speak to that as well. Y'all can hear me? Okay. You know, as a historian, I've taught for longer than I care to admit, the history of the civil rights movement. And when you teach the history of the civil rights movement, often students will say, well, we need, in the past, well, you know, we need a civil rights movement now. Things are wrong now. When are we going to have a movement again? You know, and they'd say, when are we going to get another Martin Luther King? And what the standard answer was that, well, there's periods of preparation and periods of action. And before the civil rights movement broke out, there were people who for decades worked doing groundwork, building things. And then for a variety of reasons that converged together, all of a sudden change was possible. And the civil rights movement opened and things genuinely did change. And so you would tell these students, you would say, well, we're preparing now. You have to do what you can do. And then, you know, when the moment comes when change is possible, you need to be ready. So we need to do what we do now, but it's not, you know, it's not the time. And of course, we taught that not knowing if that time would ever come, but it's here. But the thing is, it doesn't, just because the time for change is here doesn't mean it's going to happen. It means it's possible that all of a sudden, for a whole set of things have converged and real change is possible, but it will depend on what we do now as to determine whether it really happens or not. So it's possible now in a way it wasn't before, but we can't say what will be the outcome.
Thank you, Dr. Grundy.
Good, we probably wouldn't be historians. I'm really good at the past, not predicting the future, but it does feel like a moment of possibility. Things like the monuments coming down and the flags coming down. On one hand, well, they're just symbols, but man, those symbols have been around all my life. And people who I love and care about have been wanting them down, and now they're down. And so that possibility is very heartwarming, as is actually this coming together is part of a focus on affordable housing that came out of the last moment of possibility, which was the protests that came in the wake of the Keith Lamont Scott shooting. And for generations, we had not really had political will to do very much about affordable housing. And one can debate right now whether we're doing enough. I think probably everyone on this call would agree we're not doing enough. But man, we are doing many times more than we have done than seemed possible 2 years ago. So I'm hopeful. We have a moment of possibility.
Wonderful. So now that we know that change is possible, and it is, this is a moment in time where we see the greatest activity, the greatest alignment of protest that I think we've seen historically in America, the most number of people out there protesting. And I think we hear a different language being spoken on our like more people understanding the racial injustices of the past than I've ever heard. And people really calling it for what it is, systemic racism, people using the words white supremacy, not to describe the Ku Klux Klan, but to describe the structures that oppress. So I'd love to hear from each of you, based on each of your areas of expertise, when and what was the harm done to Black Charlotteans? Okay, what was the harm done? When was it done? And what can be done? We have this moment of opportunity. What can be done to right these historic wrongs? what would and should restorative justice look like? If you could wave your wand and say, this is how we bring restorative justice to the wrongs. So what were the wrongs? When were they done? And how should we right those wrongs as a community? If you could just wave your wand and make it happen. So Reverend Shipman, you've been here probably the longest time of any of us, of any of the panelists in Charlotte. What were the biggest wrongs done to Charlotteans, Black Charlotteans, and when were they done?
I'm going to do my best to take a stab at it, but I know I have these wonderful historians who will always correct me if necessary. Let me say, in my experience, I would have to start with, and I'm going to use the vernacular of a Black Methodist minister. I'm actually going to try and read this very quickly so that it will not get off task. That's supposed to be a joke. Amen. My experience, I would have to say, and I'll do it in this fashion. I believe that my observation is progressive from the standpoint that things that have produced or the obstacles to racial equity in the Charlotte area is what I would call, and I'm gonna give you some concrete examples in a minute, but I call it the Charlotte Way. Most of you may have heard of this, but the Charlotte Way, in my perspective, is we talk, we set up committees, we do task force, we study, we do research, we get people to speak, we select certain leaders that are going to be the ones that go out and do the marketing and do the speaking. Then the actions that take place are the actions that have already been set in stone by the private meeting before the public meeting. Then those actions speak very loud and clear to my particular community in that they benefit others, but they never really benefit those who are impacted. For sake of time, let me just do two things. I'm gonna go back to when I was 2 years old, 1956. That's when the Federal Highway Interstate Act began to segregate neighborhoods and really started dividing the Black community. Then I use Interstate 77 as an example. But then the Housing Act of 1954, the year I was born, started urban, they call it renewal, but I call it urban removal. And really the Black removal of our communities across not only America, but even right here in the Queen City. From Black Wall Street, which was literally the Brooklyn community and Second Ward area, to the Good Samaritan Hospital. This is where the Panther Stadium now stands proudly. This devastation of displacement, and I believe the trauma that was also associated with it, I don't really believe the Black community has fully recovered from that kind of displacement and that type of trauma, both overt and covert. And I believe that being on the 50th position of the economic mobility list, those cities, it attests that we are in need of much work. I can speak in person for myself, both as a Black minister and also for my family. Give you another two examples. 1972, I was a student at UNCC. I attended Little Rock AME Zion Church, the old Little Rock AME Zion Church. Earl Village was a community that was behind Little Rock, and my wife's uncle, Uncle White, owned a home right where the post office is now on McDowell Street. The residents of Earl Village, where are they now? I think they've been displaced. I think the only thing that's left is the Carol Hoffner Center, which is still off of 7th Street. And real connections to that, there's some individuals who you could actually meet that are still members of Little Rock who are members of the old Brooklyn community. You need to ask them how they feel. One last example, Pastoral Church, Greenville Memorial, which was in the old Greenville community on Statesville Avenue. The decision of local leaders at that time was definitely adhering to progress, capitalism, and at that time what I call white priorities. Our congregation didn't move once, we moved twice. And when we moved, we ended up in where we are now, in the Hidden Valley community, which is a long way from where we originally were in the Greenville community. We've been there now 43 years. I could go on, but you can example after example. Fairview Homes, It was sliced up by Interstate 77. The residents of Double Oaks or Piedmont Court, Dalton Village. There are a variety of examples that probably stand in need of some of the restorative justice solutions that are in your solution, Rabbi Judy. And I really like the resolution. I had a chance to read it, and I hope we get a chance to discuss some of those projections that could be very good avenues for restorative justice.
Great, and we will discuss those at the end. We have Joel Siegel to talk about a resolution, what we're calling for, but you can still all share restorative measures. So thank you, Reverend Shipman. Powerful words, and there were some great questions asked that we will raise after we get through our initial questions. So who should we move? Dr. Grundy, you want to go next?
I'm ready. Yeah. Reverend Shipman.
Yeah.
I think you really focus. I think what we have to focus on, I mean, the wrong starts, in 1619 or before with slavery. That's where it begins. And what you see is throughout these centuries, people of African descent, first Africans, then African Americans, on and on. I mean, they build amazing things given how much oppression they've had to face over and over and over during slavery, after slavery. Then there's disfranchisement, and they build up again. Reverend Shipman, I believe I was at your church for the funeral of Pop Miller, a wonderful, amazing man who helped build West Charlotte High School and then East Mecklenburg High. I mean, but what has happened is African Americans have built up, and then what they've built up has been destroyed over and over and over. And it's not just about property. I mean, sometimes we think, in this capitalist society, as you say, well, it's all about, well, if you owned a home and if you didn't get the value you were owed for your home, then you really owed. But if you were a renter and you got kind of stuck off renting somewhere else, you don't need reparations because you didn't own anything. And I think one of the things that's most important about the history of African American communities in the South is that they didn't just have, in fact, they had very little financial capital. They had social capital. They had a community. They helped each other. They built these kinds of communities. Brooklyn is a great example. Greenville is a great example. So that even though they didn't have a lot of money and there were all sorts of obstacles they faced, they helped each other out. And what urban renewal and highway construction did, and what gentrification is doing now, is it broke those ties. I mean, you didn't just lose things, you lost connections, and that was so important. And so I think we really have to think about not only, it's not just about giving people money, although that money matters, but it's about how do we help people rebuild these connections. I'm a visual aids person. This is a book that I think is just so amazing. It's called Root Shock. Tom Hanchett, actually, the author, Dr. Mindy Full of Love thinks Tom is the greatest thing since sliced bread, so I should let him talk about this. But the idea is that when you take a plant out of the ground, you pull it up, it's got root shock. You can't just stick it somewhere else and expect it to thrive. If you're going to move it, you've got to put a lot of effort into settling it into the new place, into making it so that it can thrive somewhere else. It's not just like I say, you're not just shuffling things around. You have to, it's a living thing. You have to do that. And that's what didn't happen with any of these things. There was always a sort of, people got sent places and do it on your own. And so all of that nurturing and care to create new communities that really nurture people didn't happen. it is the root of many of the problems that we see now. And that is what we really have to figure out that we can do. So.
And Dr. Grundy, we'll have Dr. Hanchett go next, but somebody asked the question, so how can we do that? How can we restore social capital is one of the answers. But let's go to Dr. Hanchett, and then we'll go back around. I'll pass it off to Reverend Snow.
Yeah, let's let Tom answer that question.
Yeah, and Reverend, well, Tom's going to talk about the damage first, and Reverend Keaton's also on the phone, but a lot of people are asking, so is that possible? How do we restore social capital? But let's go to not Reverend Hanchett, though he's studied a lot of churches in our community. We'll go to Dr. Hanchett to share his take on the harm that was done and possible restorative measures.
I think Reverend Shipman and Dr. Grundy have said it just perfectly, but golly, you want me to talk, and so I'll talk. A key moment that I didn't know about until I went to graduate school is something called the White Supremacy Campaign of 1898. 1890s, there was an economic downturn, a little bit like 2008. And folks initially came together, black and white voting together in something called the fusion. The people who were voted out hated that. How dare you take government out of the hands of the men who own the property? And that desire to get back power, people created something they called the White Supremacy Campaign. The newspapers were helping to lead it. The party leaders were helping to lead it. And it was all across the South. It's very strong all across North Carolina. The elected government in Wilmington literally overthrown by the old line at gunpoint, only armed coup in American history on our soil. And the upshot of that in North Carolina and other states all across the South were new constitutions that said you had to pay to vote. People at the top of society can pay to vote. The rest of us, kind of a hard thing. And if you could pay to vote, you had also passed something called a literacy test, which sounds great until you remember that most of us were farmers. We learned farming from our parents out of books. And in any case, the literacy test wasn't really a literacy test. It was just a hoop you had to jump through. And if they didn't want you to jump through it, you didn't jump through it. From 1900, most African Americans and a whole lot of white folks kicked government from 1900 until 65 Voting Rights Act. The people at the top did not need to listen to most of us, African Americans, working class whites. And so every government decision made from 1900 into the 1960s, when the Voting Rights Act begins to take hold, was not made in a democracy. Highway construction, park construction, school funding, and where the street lights were. When I came to Charlotte in the 1980s, I could tell when I was in a black neighborhood because there were no street lights, usually no sidewalks. And those are things, those are the physical manifestations, but that's what I study, is that physical city. And it's a powerful indictment of cutting off opportunity for so many of us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Hanchett. I heard you speak at the last Restorative Justice, and I even took notes, and you're still teaching me as we go. Every time I listen, I learn something new. So thank you all. So the next question, I'm going to go back to Reverend Dr. Shipman. You have been connected to Charlotte for 45 years. And so I just want to know, what do you observe as the main, two parts, what do you observe as the main obstacle to racial equity? And this is for all three of you, by the way. I'm just starting with Reverend Dr. Shipman and acknowledging his connection for 45 years. So what do you observe as the main obstacle to racial equity? That's the first part. And the next is something you already touched on, Charlotte being 50 out of 50 for upward mobility. Based on your perception, how did we get there? So let's start with that, with Dr. Shipman on that.
I think I would be redundant in a lot of what I would say again. I was attempting to try and answer that earlier when I basically said that It is go back to the Charlotte way one more time. We have and I've observed this, being a student at UNCC all the way up to being a news reporter at WBTV, all the way up to being a pastor now in the Mecklenburg County for 40 years. And we have a tendency to make sure, and this is my my heart, that I hope this is not what we see happen. But we have a tendency to try and quiet down the disturbances by throwing a little money at something that will create a pause where the protest or the momentum that it seems to be moving in the right direction is squalled. So my hope is that the Charlotte way would be dismantled. In other words, just putting a committee together, putting some people up, making sure that we have a media display, say something about it. Hopefully it'll die down and things will go back to normal. I hope we will never go back to, quote, what the normal used to be. That's my first statement.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Grundy, would you like to address that next?
Or I get to be the next. I mean, I think Reverend Dr. Shipman is exactly right in terms of the Charlotte way. And I think that that is really based on a complete faith in the market and in market forces. And the idea that maybe you have to tweak a little here, you tweak a little there, but that in the end, the greatest good comes if you let the market do its thing. You let the people who could afford to buy a house in Biddleville buy it regardless of, the people who have money can do what they want, and somehow that is good for everyone. I think it's just become clear over the years that that's simply not true. The market rewards those who already have resources. And so if you're going to say, we'll just let everything, like gentrification, I think is a great example of this. You sort of say, well, in these gentrifying communities, why shouldn't the people who can afford to buy these houses that they want buy them and fix them up? And somehow the people who used to live in them, well, somehow the market will make a place for them. Somehow they'll find a place to go, which is also what happened with urban renewal, where there was no provision for housing for the people who were displaced. There was supposed to be, but there really wasn't. And again, there was this sense, well, it must be okay. And the people who were in charge did not care enough about the people who were displaced to actually figure out whether they were going to be all right or not. They're just sort of like, the market will do it. And it works for us, it must work for other people. And we have just got to get away from this, because the market works for people with money. It does not work with people who do not have money. And we just have to come to terms with that.
Thank you. Dr. Hanchett, is there anything you'd like to add to that? You're muted, sir.
There we go. That is a powerful observation. Let me take that and maybe turn it a slightly different way. I was raised, as I think almost all Americans are, to assume that if things are the way they are now, it's because the market put them there. That if people live separately, well, people like to be their own kind, and as I've dug into this, I've got some slides. I wonder, Donna Tarney, I've got about 4 or 5 slides that will talk about how some of the patterns we see today are actually created by historical forces, not necessarily market forces. I did a book many years ago. It's just out in a new edition called Sorting Out the New South City. It's a long title. It's basically a history of how Charlotte got segregated. And if you had asked me when I came to Charlotte in 1980, segregation always existed, right? No. Well, right after the Civil War, right? No. Well, maybe after Reconstruction? No, it actually, I found, began to really crystallize around 1900. And that white supremacy campaign was the thing that triggered it. But that was not the end of the historical forces, because throughout the 20th century, we keep making decisions that pile on top of the old decisions, and you end up with a situation that is just radically skewed from natural reality. And so, next slide, if we can, I want to show you Brooklyn. We keep talking about Brooklyn. Many of you who've been on this journey know Brooklyn way better than I do. But Brooklyn was a city within a city. It was created around 1900. That's J.T. Williams at the upper right. He was a political leader into the 1890s. He was also top U.S. to Sierra Leone and West Africa for about a decade, around 1900. Wow. His house is at the upper left. Grace AME Zion Church, which he helped get built, is in the middle. And then down below is the Black Main Street, 2nd Street. 2nd and Brevard were both business streets. That's the Afro-American Mutual Insurance Company in the middle. In the distance under the tree, First Black Public Library in North Carolina. 2nd Ward High School, which still has a National Alumni Foundation. And on the left, a lot of the houses in Brooklyn were not fancy at all, because they were owned by outside landlords, absentee landlords, who rented them out to working class African Americans. And I've been looking at that picture on the left for a while, and I'm embarrassed to say this. I've discovered something about myself, which embarrasses me. When I first looked at that picture on the lower left, I said, oh, that's a bad neighborhood. Look at how run down that is, and all of that. And it must be bad people living in that neighborhood. And I apologize for having thought this, because the more I've looked at that photograph, I look at those houses, and they haven't been painted, maybe once in their lifetime. But it's not the tenant's job to paint a house. And the houses are real, they're just shoved right close together. And well, actually, the tenant has no say over where the house is placed. There's no sidewalks, there's no street. The tenant doesn't do that. And increasingly, when I think about a neighborhood like that, I don't know if it's a bad neighborhood, but if there are bad people, it's not necessarily the people in the neighborhood. It is most definitely people outside the neighborhood. So this city is what we lost. And the losing of it happened in the 1960s, but really it was being nibbled before that. Next slide. I'm going to show you a couple of maps from the 1930s and 40s. On the left is what's now called redlining, which is now illegal. It was during the Great Depression. The banks quit lending. Same thing they did in 2008. And help the banks. That's what we do. And so they did this thing, which actually sounded pretty cool, which was credit mapping. Let's go around, let's talk to the people in every community, find out where the good credit risk neighborhoods are. We'll color them green, we'll color them blue. And on the left in Charlotte, down at the bottom is Dilworth. Over to the bottom right is Myers Park and Eastover. Hard right, that's Elizabeth. Upper right, Plaza Midwood and Charlotte Country Club. All of those blue and green neighborhoods with good credit risk. Any neighborhood with black folks in it is red. Black, bad credit risk. Most white folks, yellow, bad credit. What it means is that it becomes really hard to go down to the bank, even if you got the money, and get a loan. Well, on the right is the zoning map in Charlotte. And the colors are slightly different, but green is single family zoning. And you can see all of the single family zoning, the most desirable, is on the lower right and far right of the zoning map. And so what zoning did was to reinforce earlier patterns of racial inequality. So there are good neighborhoods, the white neighborhoods, and then all the other neighborhoods, well, And next slide. I picked out Brooklyn. And on the left, you can see that Brooklyn was redlined. that means that even if you lived down the street from J.T. Williams and you wanted to buy a house in the neighborhood and you had that kind of money, you weren't going to get a loan. And on the right is the zoning. And there, yellow is the worst category. That's industrial. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to build factories there, but it's a signal to those landlords. Don't paint that house. It's going to get torn down eventually. Get the money out of it now, you know, rent it out. But so what you're looking at is systemic disinvestment. Disinvestment didn't just happen. It happened because of this sequence. Next slide. And so when you get to the 50s and 60s and the federal government is giving cities money to tear down slums, Brooklyn, to outsiders, kind of looked like a slum. And it had no political power because of that white supremacy campaign. Voting rights hadn't happened yet. And so the decision to tear down Brooklyn was not made in consultation with the folks in the neighborhood. And it looked to outsiders like the right decision because they could see how run down the neighborhood, how bad a neighborhood it was. Oh, man. And understanding just a little bit of that sequence breaks my heart and makes me wonder, you know, what I'm accepting, because it just seems natural and normal.
Well, and let me speak to that. I'm gonna piggyback a little bit on what Tom says, because he's utterly right. Because social capital you don't see. You saw rundown houses. You did not see the neighborly connections among the people living in those rundown houses. That wasn't visible. And so it doesn't get taken into account. I mean, it might not have gotten taken into account anyway, because people were trying to tear houses down to make money. So they might have discounted it. But I think, you know, the difference between, particularly in African American communities, particularly in communities where there just isn't much money, the most important things aren't necessarily visible. In Myers Park, you go and a lot of things that matter are just right there on display. You see the big houses, you see all that. You go to, you know, you go out Central Avenue and you go to some of these apartment complexes. You don't see anything particularly nice looking, but there are these social connections that you don't see, that you only know if you're able to become part of that community and learn something about it. And I think that's just tremendously important. And again, that's not something that you could say, oh, this house is worth X number of dollars, so we'll give you that number of dollars and then everything will be okay. You know, that's not how social capital works. That's not how connections work. And our society is not very good about that. So again, I think to make it right, it's not just money. I mean, money matters, and I'm not going to discount money, but there are other things that are also very important. And how can you help people build them back?
And if I may just make a quick statement. I thank Brother Hanchett because I learn something every time I'm around him, as well as you too, my sister. I have to say that the social capital was the energy of the community that kept Black entrepreneurs alive and running well when everything else was segregated. So you have funeral homes, you have insurance companies, you have hotels, there were some homes in that area in Brooklyn that were not just those shanty shacks. There were some nice homes in that area as well. I know because some of my members have told me about their own families who lived in that particular area. So it was the social capital was the sororities, the fraternities, the churches, all of that made that community work. And the only way that I can see that being reignited is one of the things that was in the resolution that I know they'll talk about later is that type of an investment community trust bank of some sort where you are literally putting funds in place to allow some of those same entrepreneurs or the families of those entrepreneurs to be able to get interest-free loans, to be able to start moving into the business areas where they can recoup some of that, making some affordable homes available in those areas. I mean, it's a variety of creative ways you can do it, not just throwing money at it, but creating the environment where the community can actually reignite itself, for lack of a better word.
So Dr. Keaton is here, and he's our chair of restorative justice, Charlotte, and our visionary. So we're going to pass the ball to him to move us forward and talk about his vision.
Again, just great comments. This is like my third or fourth time hearing Tom and Pamela Grundy speak. And like Pastor Shipman said, every time I hear them speak, I learn something new. But I wanted to ask you real quickly about this issue of segregation, because I think the turning point for me was reading your book and learning about segregation, and then reading the Leading on Opportunities Task Force and seeing segregation identified as a cross-cutting factor. So I began to think about that. Because if the report blames segregation as the root cause of why Charlotte is 50th out of 50th, then the next question you have to ask yourself is, well, how did Charlotte get so segregated? And then Tom Hanchett answers that question for us, and he says, well, Charlotte got segregated through urban renewal. Now, and I thought about that because now I'm thinking about the national movement around segregation. I'm thinking about George Wallace, segregation now, segregation today, segregation forever. So we know that those who still had the Confederate spirit was very interested in keeping things segregated. And I think a lot of times when we think about what happened with urban renewal, we almost want to think about it like it was a failed policy that had good intentions. But when you start to really think about some of these things, you begin to wonder, okay, it was a federal policy, but was it used by those who did not have the best interests of everybody in the community? Because again, and so then that puts the responsibility of the 50th out of 50th designation, that puts the responsibility squarely back on the shoulders of city government and the county, because they were the impetus, they were the driving. And when you look at the minutes of the city council when they voted to pass it, it was a contentious city council meeting. There were people who thought that it was a bad idea. There was people who testified that there was around $75 million of value. And so I want to agree with Pastor Shipman that it wasn't just run down houses. You had teachers from Bidville, you had teachers from West Charlotte High. I mean, you had lawyers and doctors, and and again, also we have to remember is this was a land that they didn't want. This is, from my understanding, I got to be careful because we have two historians on a call. But from my understanding, this was an area where the former slaves sort of collected and found themselves, because this was the land in Mecklenburg County and Charlotte that they didn't want because it was floodlands. So the shotgun houses and everything that's built on stilts and all that. And so the powerful thing about that, like, sure, there was some homes there where everybody wasn't rich. But keep in mind, a generation before that, they were in slavery. And they never really got the kind of assets, you know, and the thing, and that's and again, it's so powerful because Reconstruction was working to some extent. And it was those individuals who did not want to see it work. Places like Tulsa, there was a Black Wall Street. Places like Greensboro, Durham. What happened in Wilmington? You talked about the fusion vote and how there was a party of white and blacks, and it was right after the fusion vote. Correct me if I'm wrong, where the only coup in America that happened in Wilmington, that happened after that vote. Am I correct? So they tore down a newspaper, it was a Black newspaper there.
Yes, sir.
They tore it down. And my family is from there.
They burned it down.
They burned it down.
They burned it down. I have family that lived in Wilmington.
Yeah, my family's there too.
It gets emotional for me. I have family in Wilmington.
I have family in Wilmington too. My dad is right there. And so every time, you know, they always talk about that. They always talk about that. And the idea was, you know, after the election, there were some blacks who got voted in to be an alderman, I believe it was. And the whites decided, well, we're not going to honor the results of the election, and we're going to kill the blacks. And they threw them in the Cape Fear River, where I've been fishing many a times. And so I've heard those stories. So one of the things that we have to do, and I think because of the death of George Floyd and because of the protests and uprisings, this is the only moment where we may be able to say it where it don't get rejected. And what we have to acknowledge and what we have to begin to receive is that the powers that be in North Carolina was under the leadership of those who were sympathetic towards white supremacy and the Confederacy. And so let's not make it seem as though urban renewal was just was good intentions, because there was Julius Chambers, and you know their office was firebombed right here in Charlotte. Am I correct? And they were beginning to talk about Charlotte and calling it Little Birmingham. Am I correct about that? And so there was hate here. Urban renewal didn't happen, and the wealth of African Americans that was stolen, that just didn't happen because it was a bad idea. That happened because the Confederate spirit was alive and well, and still is alive and well. So let's now turn to Joel Siegel. Joel has been, because I could talk about that for a while, and I see Judy gave me a cue there. All right, so Joel Siegel, he's been working with us on the resolution, and he's done some marvelous work. In the next 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes that we have, you could go through the resolution and open up the floor to questions. And if anybody have any questions, we'll do the best that we can to. The floor is yours, Joel.
Joel, everyone's been asking, well, what do we do? How can we restore it? And I think that this resolution, there are many levels of engagement, but this resolution is a great first step to moving this forward, just saying enough talk, enough research, enough meetings, let's move forward and right historic wrongs. So Joel will present you the resolution and the vision and how you all can help move this forward. If you're on board, there are other ways for engagement if this is not your passion, civic engagement in this.
Okay, hi, good evening. I'm Joel Siegel. I am formerly worked on Capitol Hill for the distinguished Representative John Conyers from 2000 to 2013, who was the author of the reparations bill, H.R. 40, but I also worked for City Councilman Dan Clodfelter for about 4 years when I left law school. So what I'm hoping to bring to the table is experience, having worked in government for many years and kind of know the machinery of writing bills and writing resolutions and how to get them passed. I want to thank Reverend Shipman because I've actually known him since I'm 13, and he's one of my great mentors on a spiritual and intellectual level. And then I have a new mentor named Dr. Reverend Willie Keaton, who basically all I did was I took his scholarship, which was this great paper that he wrote on restorative justice and stolen Black wealth, and used his, not only the history of his scholarship, but what Reverend Keaton said we needed to do. And he used this beautiful language called that she said, Charlotte is a tale of two cities, one for the wealthy and one for poor Black low-income communities. And if there ever is going to be restorative justice, and I have to underline the word he used, healing and transformation, we would have to address these historical wrongs with very concrete action. So Restorative Justice CLT and other community leaders have drafted a resolution that we anticipate the City Council will introduce in the next few weeks. Now, the operative word is we anticipate. Now, the purpose of the resolution is to accomplish three things. One, have the City of Charlotte apologize for the decimation and stolen Black wealth in the community of Brooklyn and Second Ward due to ill-conceived, immoral, and reckless urban renewal policies in the early 1960s. Have the City of Charlotte officially adopt the goal of Charlotte being #1 in upward mobility instead of being last in upward mobility. We are 50th out of 50 cities in upward mobility. And as Reverend Shipman said, there's been study after study after study. And what Reverend Keaton has said is Black people in Charlotte cannot afford another study because their problems and their pain are too severe. And I think we would all agree with that. We want to provide a restorative justice glide path through policies that will facilitate upward mobility that we collectively believe would move Charlotte to address past historical wrongs and current wrongs, not just the past, but current against Black people. I'll just give you some examples of what we're citing we would like to see happen as a part of restorative justice, based primarily on Professor Keaton's work. Housing for all Black people, 90% of homeless people, Judy probably has the statistic, are Black. I don't know if that's in the shelters or on the waiting list. Jobs for all, tuition-free college and training schools, excellent public schools instead of segregated and dilapidated public schools in the Black communities, recreational centers and mentoring programs, world-class public transportation, universal health care, access to COVID care, testing, treatment, high-quality preschool and child care, a Black studies curriculum from the 7th grade to 12th grade. Now, that's not the whole list. And then Willie's idea of an investment, basically a fund to rebuild infrastructure, which I think is unbelievably visionary and quite exciting. Now, we're going to need the largest grassroots and grass tops coalition that we probably have maybe ever seen in this city if we're going to pass this resolution. It will not be easy. We will need a rainbow beloved community to pass this resolution. Now, why do I say that? We had a very productive meeting that Judy, Reverend Shipman, Willie Keaton, Rodney Sadler, and a few other leaders. This was basically a meeting with former Mayor Jennifer Roberts and the rest of us. And it was Malcolm Graham, I believe Braxton Winston, Matt Newton. We have been in discussion with Diplo Azumer. That was last week. Now we're still waiting to hear back from City Councilman Graham about what's going to happen with this resolution. I will say, in some of my private conversations with some city council members, there are some parts of the resolution that are creating what's called heartburn. And I tell you what it is, it's the restorative justice aspects of the resolution, which are the most important and salient parts of the resolution. And I just listed what some of those are. The concern is that if you pass this resolution, then the city would be bound to actually accomplish these restorative justice goals. Let me close by saying the population of Charlotte is right now approximately 2,054,000 people. I believe the breakdown is 1/3 Black, 1/3 Hispanic, 1/3 white. Now, there's 11 city council members and 1 mayor, and there's 9 county commissioners. So this is a question that I would like to posit to this group. If we have over 2 million people, then how could 21 people stop forward progress on the upward mobility of Black people? So we have the fourth branch of government, Mr. Connors used to call it, we the people. And that's basically what we're talking about. Mr. Connors used to say we had the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary branch, but he said, Siegel, the most important branch is we the people. And this is about democracy. And that's all it is. This is about democracy in action. I think it's important that we present our resolution that we are the majority of the city of Charlotte. There's nothing radical about this. It's just positive reforms. It's just long awaited change. That's taken about 400 years. And I'll just stop there and say that this is a great opportunity to engage the business community, the interfaith community, the academic community, people of all walks of life. I really think that we're going to pass this. We are going to send out a letter that Willie has crafted, where we're going to ask your support for the first draft of the resolution. We expect there to be changes, and that's it. I'll leave it. I'm very excited about this, so thank you. It's called progress.
Is there any, before we close, we got about 5 minutes. Is there any questions for the floor or for any of the panelists or for anybody? Any comments or anything like that before we dismiss? No? I guess not. On behalf of Restorative Justice, really want to thank—
Wait, Willie, hold on. There was Judge Rex had raised his hand. So
Okay.
if you want to unmute yourself, Judge Rex Marvel, and ask your question, that would be awesome.
Hi, thank you so much. And I really appreciate the historical context of this. I know I've been fortunate to attend Tom Hanchett's historical cover before, and it's obviously, I appreciate all of your perspective. Many of you might have seen that our Chief Justice Beasley did a really historic thing by calling out a lot of the systemic racism in the courts in North Carolina, and a few other judges across the country have followed suit locally. Many of the district court judges, myself included, have made a pledge to be better and do better. I work in family courts, and COVID is giving us the opportunity to kind of rewrite some of the policies or the courtroom policies. As you know, as judges, we can't change the law, but we can change kind of policies and procedures. And we're doing that right now. I just wanted to know if there's anything that I should be looking for that we should continue to bring to the table to make our courts more equitable going forward. Thank you.
I think
I'll say one. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say just one thing. I think
Go ahead.
you go back to urban renewal, and really awful things happened because people in charge did not really consider the full humanity of the people who were affected by their decisions. They saw them as somehow different from themselves, as they just didn't care enough to really consider what the true consequences were, given that the people they were dealing with were human beings just like themselves. And so the extent, and I think historically in the court system, African Americans have fared badly, and partly because judges and juries and the politicians who set the sentencing requirements and all that have not seen them as fully human as white folks. I mean, that's just a fact. You know, there's just all these kinds of prejudice, like, oh, you know, pain's not as much. Oh, they don't have the same level of moral, all of these kinds of things. So I think constantly being aware that those are prejudices in so many people's minds, and being able to say, this is a human, this is not a quote unquote felon, a criminal. This is a human being just like me. And I have to really think about what I do in that way, and really think about the full humanity. That's kind of what I.
Thank you, Dr. Grundy. I just noticed that we had a couple of other questions. I know we're almost out of time, but one question was, will the date of the city council meeting be publicized so that we can attend? And someone else asked along those same lines, do we need to write our city council members?
Let's see. Yeah, so I just put in the chat, please email me at joel, joel.r.siegel@gmail.com, or call me at 571-344-1518. Professor Keaton will be sending out advisories in terms of anything having to do with the strategy, city council meetings, where we're needed. But Professor Keaton is planning on organizing something very shortly where we're going to talk about the resolution, and I'm honored to be a part of this. So yeah, everyone would be apprised of when those meetings are, but we are going to need everybody's help, and your family and your friends. I love to read history, but I'd rather make it. But it's going to take an entire beloved community to get this passed.
Right. Thank you so much, Joel. And I know we have more questions, but we are at time. Is that you, Judy?
Well, we have a meeting on July 28th at 6, a Greenspan advocacy meeting to really brainstorm how are we going to move this resolution forward. So if you want to take it and move it forward and bring it to your community, that would be a critical meeting. So if you write Joel, or if you go to restorativejusticecharlotte.org or the StanGreenspanCenter.org, we will invite you. It's going to take a lot of work. We saw what happened in Asheville last week. We can make restorative justice happen here, and it is time to do that. There are also ways you can contribute individually. When we first brought this to Mayor Lyles, she said it's easy for a city council that's largely those who are marginalized and were victimized to apologize. But we want to bring people to the table who benefited from that urban renewal and urban removal. And so what does it mean for people to give donations? Restorative Justice Charlotte to say, you know what, I did wrong and I want to make it right, and I am apologizing and I'm giving. And our goal is to restore Black Wall Street, right? That Brooklyn, the center of Brooklyn Village was this building right now. It's called the Brooklyn Collective, and that's where Restorative Justice Charlotte, our office is, on the 3rd floor, which was the Mecklenburg Investment Corporation. And so we are creating a Mecklenburg Investment Corporation Trust, a trust for Black upward mobility. And it will be a fund. I'd like it to be a $20 million fund, a $100 million fund, a $250 million fund that grants to the Black community for upward mobility in the areas where harm was caused. Re-entry, because we built where Brooklyn was, a courthouse and a jail. Education, we tore down schools. Trauma, right? We caused trauma by uprooting a community. We destroyed 10 Black churches in the 60s. Black churches can't even afford their ministers, and we have white churches that are quite well off. and synagogues and mosques and all of that. So really, I think we can each say we did wrong, those of us who benefited and support it. You can also support it with your time and your energy. We can go to corporations and we can create like something like a tax district around certain areas of Brooklyn where an added tax goes directly into the fund to make sure we're not uprooting families and maintaining anti-displacement funds to keep people in their homes. So there's a lot we can do. We invite you on this journey. We want headlines that, and we want headlines here and across the country that make us proud of our city. Rather than being last, we can indeed lead the way. So Dr. Keaton, any, and Reverend Snow, any final words I welcome, and I hate to not give our panelists.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here tonight. And if you're part of our Carolina Center for Spiritual Awakening, we have formed a community empowerment team so that we can continue to partner with Greenspan Center and others making changes in our city. So ask me about that and go directly to the Greenspan Center to be in direct contact with them about the things we've discussed tonight.
Again, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to have an open mind and open heart, and to listen, and now in these next few days, just reflect on that and just think about the reality of Charlotte being 50th out of 50th in upward mobility, but yet somehow still having the second largest banking center in America and the #1 philanthropy in all of North Carolina. How is there still so much poverty and suffering? So something to think about. Thank you. That's all I have. God bless.
Well, thank you all for being here. We are complete.